So hello everyone. I would like to welcome you once again at the second session of the Feminist Book Club of CPDP 2024. This is a series of special sessions of Gender, Law and Technology Reading Group of Law, Science, Technology and Society Research Group of the Vrije Universiteit of Brussels. Hello to this beautiful kitty as well. Thank you for the company.
Waffles. She loves Zoom.
Great, we are inclusive here, and we love animals. Today, we will host Professor Amanda Levendowski. Do I pronounce your surname correctly?
You do. Levendowski, that was exactly right.
Okay, cool. Thank you. The author of the book Feminist, Cyberlaw that will be published and will be released in June 2024. Before introducing you further, Professor Amanda, welcome again, and the reviewers, of course, of the book, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the session's format. First, we are going to start with a round of introductions of the author and the invited speakers. Then we will have the presentation of the book that will be followed with a short discussion with the author. And at the last part of this session, we are going to have a longer discussion with the reviewers. We will hear first their comments, their remarks, and then we will have a discussion. And we will open, of course, the floor to you in order to, if you have some questions to ask, like a short Q&A with the audience. So before starting, do you have any questions?
No, I'm so excited.
Perfect. So, thank you once again for accepting the invitation, Amanda. And we have you here today with us at CPDP Book Club 2024. Professor Amanda Levendowski, pronounced she, her, is an award-winning scholar, teacher, and artist whose work explores how to shape better technologies. She also trains the next generation of technology lawyers as the founding director of Georgetown Intellectual Property and Information Policy Clinic, where she supervises student attorneys performing creative legal and socio-technical work for justice-minded artists, non-profits, and coalitions. I am also very happy to welcome in this panel discussion our great reviewers, Anastasia, Nefeli, Vidaki, Plixavra, Vogiatzoglou, and Alexandros, Goniadis. Anastasia Nefeli Vidaki, pronounced she, her, is a PhD researcher at the Cyber and Data Security Lab of the Vrije Universiteit of Brussels. Her research focuses on the impacts of AI on justice, and she's also a certified lawyer, fond of the intersection between law, disruptive technologies, and society. On the left, Dr. Plixavra Vogiatzoglou, pronounced she, her, is a postdoctoral researcher at the Amsterdam Center for International Law and the Institute for Information Law of the University of Amsterdam. She holds a PhD from the KU Leuven Center of IT and IP Law, where she remains an affiliated researcher, and she is a qualified lawyer in Greece. Welcome, Plixavra. Last but not least, we have today with us Alexandros Goniadis, pronounced he, who is an operational cooperation officer at CERT EU, the cybersecurity service for EU institutions, bodies, offices and agencies. Prior to CERT, Alexandros served at the European Commission DG Connect, working on cybersecurity and digital privacy policy and legislation, and the European Consumer Organization before that. He is a qualified lawyer as well in the EU with advanced studies on ICT law, software patents, and corporate governance. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation and taking the time to read the book. So I don't want to waste your time anymore, and the floor is yours, Amanda. You can start with the book presentation, and then I can ask you some questions. Thank you so much. You have 10 minutes.
Amazing. I'm not going to take 10 minutes because I want to get to your wonderful questions and discussion.
No worries. No
Okay, perfect. So I am delighted to share Feminist Cyber Law with all of you. It's officially coming out on June 11th, so you have time to pre-order your copy. But this book really came out of my frustrations taking cyber law or cyber law adjacent courses as a law student and discovering some pretty troubling feminist underpinnings to a lot of the cases we discussed that didn't go mentioned. So one of the classic examples is a case called Perfect 10 versus Amazon, which was about whether Google image search constituted massive copyright infringement. And that is usually held out as a great fair use decision. And the court decided in that case that Google image search was a public benefit, which is probably true in the aggregate. But the facts of the case were very troubling to me when I dived into them, because the images that were allegedly pirated at issue were nude images of models that had been behind a paywalled subscription service that were being systemically scraped by pirates and reposted for free on public websites, exposing the models in a way that they had never intended. And while that comes across as deeply problematic and misogynistic, that was never part of the conversation in any copyright class I took, or even until I started teaching classes of my own. And so I knew that I wanted to write about this idea of finding out how cyber law was shaped by race, gender, sexuality, disability in class, and how laws responded to those interactions. So I wrote an article. I wrote an article called Defragging Feminist Cyber Law that's out and available from the Berkeley Technology Law Journal. And it basically revisited a bunch of core cyber law doctrines and even some meat space doctrines through this very broad feminist lens. So that article looked at sex work and Section 230 amendments. It looked at copyright and non-consensual intimate imagery, which is something that I've been writing about for a decade now. It talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act and accessibility online. It talked about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act being used to combat misogyny unsuccessfully. But it was very much an entry point for a much larger conversation, because I knew that I did not want to be like a figurehead of feminist cyber law. This was a movement for everybody. And I also didn't want my one approach to feminism to become feminist cyber law's approach to feminism. So I knew that in order for this to be a successful movement, which is what I wanted it to be, a real global movement, which it kind of is now, I would need to collaborate with other people. So during the pandemic, I gave a talk. It was a little stressful because I was moving. I was in my empty brand new apartment while movers were like going around the camera, setting stuff up. And I gave a talk about sort of the prototype for feminist cyber law. And a publisher called me and said, "Tell me more about what you're thinking around this." And I said, "I want to do a co-authored anthology or a co-edited anthology." And she said, "Absolutely." So I started working with my colleague, Meglita Jones, who is wonderful and is not here today, but fantastic. And we decided that we wanted to assemble like a dream team of scholars to create the foundations of feminist cyber law. The goal of this book was to be, first of all, the goal of this book was to explain feminist cyber law to anybody who was curious, average people, students, people who knew about cyber law, but not the feminist part, people who knew about the feminism part, but not the cyber law part. We really wanted to have a broad audience. And the other piece we really wanted was a diversity of perspectives around core cyber law doctrines so that those chapters could be assigned in those classes as a critical complement to coursework. So we have a range of examples from our 18 emerging and established scholars, practitioners, and activists who contributed new chapters about how gender, race, sexuality, disability, and class influence cyberspace and the laws that govern it. Like I said, the book expands the movement that I pioneered in defragging feminist cyber law, and it does so by critiquing how practices, policies, and power governing cyberspace can misalign with feminist values. And what I think is so powerful is the way that we approach the chapters. We grouped them by three broad categories: ownership, access, and governance. And then we focused on really diverse issues within these broad themes. And I'll highlight a couple of my favorites. I love all of these essays equally. They are all amazing. But I think some of the ones that stand out just because they're so unique and different are one of the essays is about the racialization of cybercrime and how we describe cybercrime by Russian actors as masculine and powerful, and piracy by Chinese actors as deceptive and feminized. Another one is about the use and abuse of tag marks by marginalized communities. So if you think about hashtag Black Lives Matter and hashtag ally for disability justice, those are both tag marks. They're hashtags that are also owned by an individual. But that also gives that individual power to police marginalized communities in ways that can create tension with the values of those communities. That one's by Alex Roberts. The first essay I mentioned is by Anjali Vats. We also talked about recasting Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is a quirky little American law, as an accidental abolitionist, non-reformist reform. It's a mouthful. That one's by Kendra Albert. We deconstruct the effects of a digital jobs landscape from both legal and socio-technical perspectives. Elizabeth Joe provides the legal perspective that connects privacy and decision-making with the Dobbs decision and the fallout from that decision, which as a lot of you know, banned abortion in big parts of the United States and repealed Roe versus Wade. And then on the socio-technical side, Nicola Meester and Karen Levy created a really lovely piece exploring why the harms of privacy, the physical harms of privacy, so often go unwritten in socio-technical and even legal scholarship. And then Hannah Block-Webba has this great reflection on cycles of civil libertarianism within cyber law. And she starts the essay in a way that I think is so powerful by talking about how the Electronic Frontier Foundation is housed in an old porn studio. And that really sets the stage for the kind of civil libertarian streak that we continue to see in cyber law advocacy today. And then finally, two of my favorite essays, one by Gabrielle Rejoui and one by Ngozi, oh my gosh, Ngosi's name is escaping me, by Ngozi, are about Black feminist perspectives on both antitrust and criminal law, which, again, Black feminism is not necessarily the only feminist cyber law. That was really a great example of bringing in another form of feminism to inform the feminist cyber law conversation, not just sort of a Kimberly Crenshaw, bell hooks intersectional feminism approach. So we appreciate that diversity of thought. And the goal of the volume, I hope the respondents agree, is to balance breadth and depth with accessibility. So these are very short essays. They're about 5 pages long. They do have a lot of end notes. They are scholarly pieces. They do have a lot of backed up information. But the goal is that these chapters will operate, like I said, as critical complements to coursework in intellectual property, privacy, labor, antitrust, criminal, and technology law, alongside, obviously, cyber law. And I hope that gives you a little sense of what my goals were going into the project, what the goals of the project are, and give us some foundations for conversation.
Thank you so much for this brief description of the book. And actually, yeah, the first question that I have for you is that, first of all, I really enjoyed the fact that I could read the book very easily. Like, I didn't feel that I was tiring. Yeah, like it was a kind, as you explained it before, like, yeah, short essays, but like super informative. And I really also like the fact that you provided many cases, many examples. So it was not just a theoretical somehow knowledge of that. So I think that, yeah, it was super well combined with practical examples, a practical approach. And the first question that I have for you is that one of the issues that are addressed in the book is how technology and law both shape and are shaped by gender dynamics. And with that said, I would like to ask you, like, could you elaborate this more, like probably with an example, with a case, in order for the audience to understand better the gender dynamics you describe in the book?
Yes, that's a great question. And so one of the ways you can think about, oh, Someone's waiting. One of the ways you can think about feminist cyber law is as a creative strategy for legal and socio-technical intervention. And when you think of it that way, the first law that comes to mind is the Americans with Disabilities Act, because I think in so much of the conversation around feminism, we focus on gender without its intersectional characteristics, and women are far more likely to be disabled, both in the US and internationally. And we're also more likely to be disabled at a younger age. And obviously, if you are a pregnant person or childbearing person, you will be disabled for some period of time to recover from the birth of your child. And so for a lot of women, disability is an inevitability. But the Americans with Disabilities Act is really a meat-based law. It was passed in 1990. It was meant to apply to physical spaces. But some lawyers, who I would consider feminist cyber lawyers, have cleverly appropriated the Americans with Disabilities Act to force websites to be web reader accessible to blind and low vision people, which I think is incredibly creative. It's incredibly novel, and it's incredibly feminist cyber law, right? We are taking a law that was never intended to be feminist. And when we look at this, the sort of landscape of who's enacting these laws, the US is not unique, right? Most of our legislation has been white men for the longest time. Most of them are wealthier, powerful white men, and they are making decisions for everybody. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was not intended to be a feminist law, but a clever feminist cyber lawyer can appropriate it to make the web more accessible to all people. And by making the web more accessible to disabled people, we really are making it more accessible to all people. And I think that that's like a really powerful example of what a concrete, practical example of feminist cyber law looks like in practice. The other example that I'll give really kind of inspired this project at a much deeper way was when I was a law student. I wrote my student note about using copyright to combat non-consensual intimate imagery, better known as revenge porn. And I was radicalized because I went to Wikipedia to start my research, and there was no revenge porn article. This was 2014. Is Anyone Up and Hunter Moore were like top of the news. They were creating new awful problems for women every day, and Wikipedia didn't have an article about them. So I went to my supervisor for that paper and I said, I'd like to create the Wikipedia article for revenge porn. Would you supervise me? And I think this was the first 4-credit Wikipedia editing exercise at a law school ever. And I created the revenge porn article. It still stands today. It looks really different than it did when I created it. But it has a little section about how copyright can be used to combat non-consensual intimate imagery. And I feel like that was a really underappreciated approach because so much of the conversation was on criminalization. And as a prison abolitionist, I was really uncomfortable with appropriating the carceral legal system to serve feminist goals. So a civil remedy felt appropriate. And the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is a sort of para-copyright law we have in the US, allows for notice and takedown. So if you're dealing with a reputable website, you can send a request to remove a copyrighted image and they have to comply or they lose their safe harbor and they can be open to massive copyright liability. And that's another example, sort of practical, that I'm really proud to say that my clinic has actually put into practice with a real client. We advised a coalition of domestic violence direct service providers here in the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia, about how to get non-consensual intimate imagery removed from the internet, both using socio-technical and legal means. And so I think those two examples highlight the creativity that is required for feminist cyber law, because you really need to imagine a world where things that are not for you can be appropriated by you. And you have to keep in mind the Audre Lorde quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So even as you are appropriating these laws, you're constantly considering, is this actually entrenching other power in ways that I don't intend? Is this harming other marginalized people in ways that I don't foresee? And is this creating doctrinal problems that could bite us in the ass? Maybe not next year, but maybe 5 years from now. And one of the things that I think was so powerful about this volume is we don't just have scholars. We have scholars, we have practitioners, and we have activists. And some of those roles are overlapping and blurred, but I think it was so important to me and Meg to have people. I mean, it means so much that you felt like it was practical because that's really what we wanted to do. We wanted to make sure that this wasn't theory. We wanted there to be a theory around the practice, but we really wanted this to be operationalizable by anyone who picked the book up.
Many thanks for that. And one last question is based on what you said, and given that we are going to explore the field of feminist cyber law with the reviewers in Europe, I would like to ask you, what is the most crucial topic of feminist cyber law in USA right now? Because your approach, of course, is based on USA situation. So yeah, if you have somehow to point out the most crucial feminist cyber law topic, which will be as you said previously, image-based sexual abuse, with privacy violations, online harassment, reproductive rights. Which one would you highlight?
I'm going to cheat and give you a trio. I'm sorry, I can't narrow it down to just one, but they all reflect different angles of the feminist cyber law conundrum. The first is obviously reproductive rights. And that is a much broader conversation about data brokers and location tracking in the modern digital landscape. So to me, the problem that manifests on the ground is a threat to pregnant people and women seeking healthcare. It is a privacy concern, and that is what Elizabeth's piece really dives into, and also to another extent, Nicola and Karen's piece. But it's a broader conversation about how data is collected, accessed, and used by corporations in America, and often weaponized by the government. So reproductive justice, but also appropriation of data. That's part one. Part two is, I think, deepfakes. Deepfakes are concerning for people who are concerned about election integrity. But I also feel like 90% of deepfakes, I think that's a quote from Danielle Citrin, that 90% of deepfakes are actually pornographic images or sexualized images of women, not pornographic, they're not consensual. And so I feel like the deepfakes issue that we've seen with major celebrities is also being seen with sort of what are called nudify apps, which are so gross. They just you take an image and they make the person naked. It's being used by school children to make minors nude. Some minors in a state called Florida recently got arrested for making deepfakes of their peers. I think that it is an amplification of non-consensual intimate imagery. It stems from the same dangerous misogynistic pathology of control over women's bodies, but the implications are so widespread and different, because I also feel like when we have these conversations about deepfakes, no one talks about the sex workers whose bodies are being appropriated, and their bodies are also being subject to that same sort of misogynistic control. So the deepfakes are the concrete example, but the bigger question is misogynistic technology that is deployed to control women's bodies. And I also think that this fits right in with the conversation about Scarlett Johansson's voice being appropriated for the OpenAI Sky voice, right? This is part of that same control and misogyny. So that's that one. And then the other one?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm so torn. Maybe I'll just leave it at those two. Maybe those are two big ones. They're not exhaustive, but those are two of the ones that I certainly spend the most time thinking about.
No, please go ahead. We have one more minute, yes. No worries.
No, that's fine.
If I can add something on that, what you mentioned about nudify apps, it was a recent case, a recent example in Greece, in Europe, that probably somehow a spyware is downloaded when we download another application, because it happened to a survivor that she had downloaded, I think, a social media app. It was not Meta or something, but after that, she generated somehow contact with some nudity, and probably there was a spyware that was installed in her phone, and this spyware detected the nudity, and this content was uploaded on her social media accounts. Yeah, so I don't know if you have such a relevant case in USA, But I would like now to give the floor to the reviewers, and I would like to start the discussion with you by asking you, first of all, what struck your attention while you were reading this book, and secondly, if you have to choose like one feminist topic that you think is very crucial at the moment in Europe, which one would be? From a cyber law perspective, of course. You can start and then
Thank you, Anastasia, as well. And since it's the first time I received the floor, I would like to say hi to everyone. Hi, Amanda. Everyone who is attending in person and offline. It's really an honor to be here among you and to discuss such an interesting book and so many captivating topics. And I think the best way to answer to the first question of yours, Anastasia, regarding what struck my attention while I was reading the book, is to share with all of you the feelings that I developed while I was going through the pages. And I have to admit it from the beginning that they were really diverse. When I delved into the book, like Kate Darling says in the epilogue, I got all those ahas. I was surprised by finding out about so many topics I wasn't aware before, and maybe I haven't even imagined. For example, the non-neutral non-gender neutral aspect of the patent, or all those, let's say, geopolitical perspective of the intellectual property talks that both writers in their respective essays touch upon. The second feeling, I think, was the one of guilt. I found myself feeling guilty not only for not being aware of all those interesting topics and all the problems that were raised in the book before, but also of not having done anything impactful in that sector till now. I don't know if you can understand it, but yeah, I found myself, I will use two examples again. Although in the past I understood that I supported, for example, the carb cut effect, I have never thought that it could deprive in its design the agency from people with disabilities, or for example, I have never thought how content moderation can lead to a private censorship. All those feelings were quite difficult for me to comprehend, and I think in the end I was left with two. I felt relieved because I found out that there are so many scholars, so many activists, female ones that are trying to shed or have already shed some feminist light into the dark and opaque aspects of cyber law. And on the other hand, I also felt motivated because I figured out that there was enough space for me as a female, also as a researcher, to contribute with my own expertise in that field and to try to occupy myself more with it in the future. And that was the first part of the question. Should I answer also to the second one and pass the floor after? Okay. Yes, not to eat a lot of your time. But yes, regarding the aspect that I find more crucial, I think this answer of mine to your question is going to sound a little bit biased. Excuse me in advance for that. But taking into account all those femicides that have occurred and the gender-based violence incidents that every day we witness, and not only on a European, but also I think on a global basis, I think I could not think of any other more crucial issue than the one of online harassment. And by quoting Gabrielle Rezui and her essay, I think that online attacks and physical attacks are not only closely associated, but somehow they can be also interconnected. I mean, we all use the internet, and especially social media platforms, or we use online fora, and in them we encounter other users, we encounter media posts or in general content that is misogynist or is radicalized or it is explicitly or even implicitly supportive of gender-based violence and such behaviors. And I think in view of the cyber law, it is really important to understand that this phenomena is encouraged by communities that are really active and they are really engaged online, and they somehow replicate the already existing in the offline world harmful gender-based stereotypes, but they even enhance them online. To keep it short, I would like to point out that it is really important, it is crucial to figure out what has caused this emergence and this domination of a manosphere online, and to find the ways, the best ways, I would say, to mitigate it and to understand that what happens online is not something different with what happens in the real world. We are listening on the news about stalking incidents, about gender violence, about all those attacks, sexual harassment that have started online or have been afterwards aggregated online and leave behind them many victims and many people that have suffered. So for me, that would be the one.
Gender-based violence is a kind of iceberg. Like we can see in the up of the surface that okay, there are some instances, but the most of the time there are so many other instances that are occurred down of the surface that are not visible. But based on that, all the other instances occurred. And of course, unfortunately, the most of the times, they are combined. Probably in some cases they start in the analog world and then they continue in the cyberspace and online. But in the other cases, it's the other way around. But yeah, unfortunately, it is a phenomenon that it takes place in both worlds, digital and analog one. Now, Plixavra, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to already have our hands on this very interesting book before it comes out. And thank you, Amanda, for presenting it to us. So I will have a combined answer to both things. And I was actually writing down some notes today on the book, having in mind Audre Lorde's famous quote: "The master's tools will never be able to dismantle the master's house." So often in my work, I wonder to what extent can we look to law to bring solutions, or do we have to look outside and external ways to dismantle these types of discriminatory practices and hierarchies? And I wonder to what extent we can already know in advance which type of reforms can be non-reformist and have a backlash effect, or to what extent we can look for these examples of, like the one you described earlier, of appropriating laws to our benefit. And I focused a bit more on the last part of the book that I was more familiar with, and there we saw a lot of examples of laws that had all the good intentions, or practices that had all the good intentions and then had failed to meet these expectations. So, for example, the content moderation and the civil libertarianism, it was all about free speech, and then it ended up restricting sexual speech. And yet still, the author does not want to give up on it yet. It says maybe we can revive it. Because given everything that's going on, maybe it can actually now help us with ensuring that information on abortion can still be available. Another example in the book was about consent and seeing data protection laws as individual control, and how that has also failed to provide sufficient information to users on what are the expectations, what they should expect about how their data can be used. And there too, and in another chapter on content moderation, the authors look to law to find solutions and look to the governments to provide incentives to big tech and to platforms to create technological solutions that would protect minorities and vulnerable groups. And there I have to say, also coming from the European background and bringing this discussion in comparison with the EU, we do have very strict or stricter perhaps regulation or detailed regulation, for example, on data protection, and having a regulation that is not just about consent, but also about other legal bases has not stopped data being abused and misused. Having not only data protection, but also competition, consumer laws, trying to limit big tech also doesn't work. So what do we do? And there, the final chapter by Ngozi Okitekpe, if I pronounce their name correctly, for me was what really shined through the most. And while they admit that it might be a revolutionary approach that they bring forward, that it might be too, I quote, too radical for our current system. I felt like it was giving a different approach, because sometimes looking at what law can do feels like a catch-22. It goes a bit circular. And perhaps just trying to imagine different approaches and different ways to approach things is a first step. Instead of always trying to fix the law, maybe let's try to think about other things. And what I really liked about that chapter is the Black feminist approach, as you also mentioned earlier, that invite us to resist dominant knowledge production sites like courts and institutions, like a criminal legal system, which feels a little bit perhaps uncomfortable for people like me who I'm a European. I was always very mesmerized by European human rights law, let's say, and looking to courts to provide solutions, and then that dream comes crumbling down. But I like this idea that we have to be more critical and to give space and engage, and here I also provide some quotes, with epistemes of those subordinated, create new institutions designed to promote subjugated knowledge and disrupt hierarchical knowledge production practices. And that can happen, for example, by allowing community members to task themselves with presenting their own knowledge, as well as being compensated for that labor that they deliver and produce. So with this in mind, I think that the most crucial topic of the feminist cyber law and feminist governance of technology in general is to amplify those voices, question and consider our own positionality, which is one of more privilege at this moment, and question the spaces where knowledge is being produced and how we can bring this to our work, be it as academics, as practitioners, and so on. Thanks.
Do I just go ahead? Okay, great. So thanks everybody. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Amanda, for giving us the opportunity to read your book. First of all, I usually go by Alex, not Alexandros. It's the Greek review club over here. Now, I'm not an academic, I'm not a scholar. So I consider myself as part of the broader audience of the book, and I must say that it was immensely appreciated. A lot of fresh stuff in there, certified fresh, congratulations. And those aha moments, I mean, it was happening all the time when I was going through the book. And I guess I have to choose a few that I could talk about. I cannot talk about everything. So I chose to talk about something that has been close to my heart in the sense that I've worked on this a little bit when I was a student, because I was also in the same discipline, law, data protection, privacy, combination with technical aspects of intellectual property, and now working on cyber security. And the thing that I wanted to talk about is bias. And we see algorithmic bias, we see law bias, we see societal structure bias. And as a subject, it's not exactly new. Like algorithmic bias is something that the privacy community has been talking about a lot. Of course, there is a lot more to talk about, but it has been out there. Bias in law is something that civil society has been fighting against for decades, so again, it's not something new. But there was one aspect of it that I read in the book that really sparked something in me. And the example that I'm going to use is patent law. It's the article about patent law. And it happened that I did a comparative study myself on software patents between the US and the EU. And I realized that, you know, the feminist aspect was something that it never really occurred to me back at the day when I did my research. That was almost 15 years ago. And I read that now, and suddenly it was like, wow, brand new perspective over there. And the author of the book is using the example of ENIAC. ENIAC was the first programmable computer that was developed during World War II. The people that are that developed the hardware part of the computer are two men. The people who developed the programming aspect of the computer was a group of women. However, when somebody refers to ENIAC and the inventors of ENIAC, it's only the men that are being referred to, right? The women are nowhere. However, the programming aspect of ENIAC was equally or maybe even more important because that was the reason why the computer was created, in order to perform the action that that group of women was meant to do. And that got me thinking of how do we deal with something when it's not even there? How do we find it when it's not even there? Because when it comes to algorithmic bias, there is a sort of easy test that you can use in order to find it. Easy in the sense that it can be straightforward. You use the example of two people with identical characteristics, but one difference. You know, there is a difference in gender, there is a difference in race, there is a difference in sexual orientation. But the people, all the other attributes and characteristics of the people are the same. So you fit it in the platform and you see what kind of result comes out. And if the results are different, just because of the difference in race, you can sort of identify that there is a bias in the algorithm or in the platform. But what if the whole discipline is not there? Because patent law, when I was studying it, it was considered to be fine. I mean, it's gender neutral. Nobody talks about who the inventor is. I mean, if you need to be a man or a woman or however you identify yourself as. So how do you see that? And it struck me that the author of the article argues that one of the reasons why this is important is because patent law is used in order to measure innovation in society. And when you completely exclude the group of people from the way that you measure innovation in society, it feels as if that group of people is not innovative at all. So it's not creative at all. So they do not exist in this kind of measurement of creativity and innovation in society. What's interesting is that initially in the US, software programming was not a patentable subject matter. And that was at the time when primarily it was women working on computer programming. However, a few decades later, when that shifted, when there were more men working on software programming and the subject matter, the discipline became more masculine, along with that changed the approach of patent professionals and patent courts and patent authorities that suddenly thought that computer programming is innovative, and they started considering it as a matter that could be part of a patent application. It could be given the privilege of having such exclusive rights that a patent gives. So in a way, they were suggesting that when women were doing something, it was not considered creative or innovative, but as soon as things shifted, suddenly it became creative and innovative. And I would like to use a quote from the book. So the author says that patents are not gender-neutral instruments, but rather reflect the value that society places or doesn't place on women's work. And rather than measuring innovation, the patent system more accurately measures the value our society places on certain activity with sexist results. The author goes on to suggest other examples where this may be happening, even now, because this is something that we talked about like in the 60s. It keeps on happening. So we see a situation where something is considered innovative enough to be given the privilege of a right, a very exclusive right with great gravity, but something is not, and is deprived of that right merely because of the people who had been working on it. And in this example is women, but it may as well have been marginalized, other types of marginalized communities. So that's something that struck me, as if, in the sense that when you look at different disciplines and when you look at different legislation, this is an aspect that doesn't really occur to you sometimes, because if it's not there and you don't know if you have to look for it in the first place, how can you identify that there is a problem? Now, when it comes to me choosing something that I consider as most important, to answer your second question, I'm not sure if I'm exactly in a position to choose one or the other, or any of the three. Well, partly because I suppose I'm not in a position because of the fact that I lack a certain important aspect of the equation, the fact that I'm, a white male. What do I mean that I lack something? I lack the feeling of what it feels like to be on the other side. I try to understand. I'm there. I see it happening, but I like the feeling, which is an important aspect of it. So being in a situation that I cannot exactly choose myself right now, I chose to pick something that is sort of horizontal. And again, it's about bias, and the way that you try to identify bias in algorithms and platforms. And there is an article in the book that suggests that a lot of researchers and journalists are trying to hack into platforms, or are trying to use platforms in order to conduct that little example that I talked about before. So using two fictitious people with different attributes, but with similar attributes, but different gender, for example, fit it in the platform and try to see the results. Or there are others that are a bit more intrusive. They try to sort of hack into the system and try to identify the errors in the algorithm in order to report it and in order to somehow fix it. Now, there is an important problem in that, in the approach that the law has. One is the possible civil liability that somebody has because you are using a platform against the terms of use when you signed up to use that platform. And then again, that it might be as well legal, criminal liability, in the sense that we are hacking into a system. And when in the EU, when there is a decision, an automated decision about a person, you are entitled to know the underlying reasons and as much as possible about the way that this decision has been made. In such situations, you may get your answers. You may not, but at least there is a trigger that something is going on, so you may want to look further into it. But there are other cases in which you don't even know that you are being subject of such a biased approach. And the example used by the author is job advertising, like behavioral advertising, especially the job market. When something would go to men because it's a masculine discipline, and it wouldn't go to women because they're not expected to be working in this kind of discipline. So if you're not aware that you're not seeing this kind of ads, you have no way to react to it. And there is an important job performed by researchers who try to find this kind of errors in platforms and algorithms out in the wild. So they do it themselves because they want to help the community understand what went wrong and try to fix it. In the security community, we've talked a lot about that, but from a sort of different perspective. So there are a lot of ethical hackers out there that try to identify vulnerabilities in systems, in platforms, in programs, and they report them so that those vulnerabilities are fixed and the systems become more secure. The perspective is different, the purpose is different, but the acts that they perform sort of fall into a similar, let's say, example. In the cybersecurity community, we are trying to find solutions to this that I think could be useful for the civil rights community as well. So, for example, in order to bypass legal and criminal liability, there is a huge movement that has resulted in policy making and laws in several countries that allows researchers to perform such acts on the basis of a few criteria. First of all, there is an overarching public interest in place, which from the cybersecurity perspective is of course keeping the systems safe. If they're not safe, somebody might exploit it. It might affect the personal data of people who use those systems or other aspects of security. You need to do something that is proportionate. So you do as much as necessary in order to identify what the problem is. You are in good faith, so you don't just go out there and publicize it in a way that you want to damage the platform. Of course, there are instances where you know that the platform has been repeatedly doing that and they are biased, so an activist community and a reaction from a civil rights perspective might as well be to be vocal about it. But let's assume that the balanced way is that you firstly act in good faith, you do it, you give them the opportunity to answer, because it's supposedly an error in the algorithm, so you give them the opportunity to answer, and if they don't, of course, you move ahead and you do it. And this is a legal regime that has been created in a few countries now in the EU, but this is an overall discussion that has been taking place for a few years now, and we are almost at the moment that we're finally finding a balanced way of dealing with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, because actually you give me the chance to ask you the second question. For instance, one aha moment for me when I was reading the book was about this chapter about gender disinformation, because I had into my mind gender disinformation. I had combined this issue with abortion and reproductive rights, but actually I think that probably this is an issue that is emerges actually in EU elections. So, I mean, like, there are different aspects of gender disinformation. So I was wondering, like, very briefly, based on your background or your experience, like academic, activist, or like in policy, do you think that EU law and EU policies, do EU law and EU policies address adequately gender-based discrimination in the cyberspace or not? And a sub-question like how we can envision the cyberspace from a feminist point of view. I'm asking this question because I have something particular in my mind, like a recent case in UK of a report, a criminal report that was submitted from a survivor because she claimed that she experienced rape and sexual abuse in the metaverse. And there are, of course, different contradictory approaches on that. That, of course, like, given that there is not a physical violence, we cannot claim that this is a rape. But she felt it as, she experienced it as in a physical way. So, yeah, very briefly, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Anastasia. Since I'm the first one, I'm going to describe to you how I envision, really briefly, EU law in the matter of somehow figuring out what happens on cyberspace. And in my mind, it is like a pyramid. And on the baseline, we have many directives that are trying to regulate it, like the DSA or the DMA. And we also have directives on the equality of the handling of women and men in the sector of their occupation or their profession. On the second level, we have more like policies or soft law instruments. Between them, I think the most prominent might be the EU Gender Equality Strategy, 2020 till 2025. And on the top of it, as a researcher, maybe I have to place all these projects, EU-funded projects, that target to combating gender inequalities and establishing the more equal, let's say, perspective between the genders. And in order to be able to answer if they are succeeding or they are failing in doing so, I have to dismantle it one by one. So with the directives, I know that the EU is in actification fever, but since they are not like regulations, they have to be transferred into each member state's national order. I don't know if they're really successful during their enforcement and if they're really able to provide a common approach to commonly shared problems. Then regarding the strategies and all these policy actions, I know that they entail really interesting and really novel perspectives, but again, drafting a strategy, for example, 5 years or 6 years before, and that expands for 5 years afterwards, I'm not sure if it's able to answer to all those questions that come up during to this rapid technological advancement. As you mentioned, for example, what happens in the metaverse. Metaverse is a really new subject that came up like a couple of years ago. So how could the EU policymaker envision it while drafting a soft law instrument 6 or 7 years ago? And regarding the last ones, the EU-funded projects, I'm really an advocate of them, and I think that since they really foster dissemination and cooperation between partners belonging also to the technical, to the digital, and to the legal and societal realm, they can provide an answer, but still we have to think that a solution to these long-term problems, because, for example, gender discrimination is an issue that did not occur on the online environment. It is something that exists offline. However, it has been transferred into the digital world. So I think these long-term problems also demand more long-term solutions. And okay, I know this is kind of an answer that is really heard, but I really I place education and raising awareness through multiple sources. Art, for example, could be one of them, into the most prominent position. I think all those novel aspects, combining with the feminist perspective and the feminist approach, like the tools that were described in the book. For example, black feminism, which was really in the governance part. I think all of those can provide us not an answer, not a solution, but at least a compass, a way to navigate through finding a solution, maybe that is not biased, that involves all the partners, and that is multi-agency and multidisciplinary supportive.
Thank you. Can I add something really quick to that? I thought that was so. What you're saying about foresight around laws around the metaverse is so interesting, because before the metaverse, there was Second Life, and Second Life posed a lot of the same legislative and legal and socio-technical issues, but lawmakers did not respond with really any force to some of the sexual harassment and sexual violence that was happening on Second Life. But we know that cyber assault has been a problem since 1996, when Julian Dibble wrote Rape in Cyberspace. This was happening with text-based Lambda MOOCs before it was happening visually. And so I do want to say that, yes, they couldn't have predicted the metaverse specifically, but if lawmakers had been thinking about the way that socially constructed gender plays out in positions of power, they could have been more proactive dating back to 1996, thinking about laws to regulate this, and not just criminal laws, but civil laws as well. I don't want to give politicians any credit.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much already. I don't think I have too much to add. I would say with perhaps the first part of the question that from a very legal perspective, we know that still intersectional discrimination is not protected under EU law, so that's already a very big flag that there is a lot to be done still with regards to legislation. And perhaps that is also mentioned somewhere in the book that this division or distinction between online harm and physical harm or real world harm is a non-existent one. It should not exist. It should not be that the threat of physical harm triggers protection. And perhaps I go back again. I really like this idea of appropriating laws that were not meant to be for us, but we can make them work for us. So if there's a creative way to do that, I think there are so many legal instruments out there, and perhaps some sort of creative ways of working with them would be the answer, because we know that most of the victims are people who are not making the laws. So we have to make them work for those victims.
Yeah, I have a positive and a sort of negative aspect on this. Well, first of all, I agree, and I will step on the things that you guys said. When I was reading the book, I was always getting these flashes of things that we see in the EU. And there are some things that we do have, of course. The GDPR, primarily, we have competition laws that deal with such aspects as well. I remember a few years ago, there was this thing called the Big Data Clearinghouse, which brought together competition authorities, the EU, the Data Protection Supervisor, and the European Consumer Organization, and they worked on the intersect of competition and the use of big data and how platforms can become very, very powerful because of that, and if that could be an asset that would be considered in competition law, from a competition law perspective. I was reading about the right to repair and how the fact that it doesn't exist marginalizes communities because people do not have the money to repair something that has been broken, and moreover, malfunctioning devices end up in third countries that are poor, and then there is community over there that is obliged to use it as a less privileged part of the world. And I was thinking that, you know, the right to repair, it exists in the EU. You're great, you know, we have that. However, my confidence is a bit shook, or shaken. Is it shook? Shaken? Anyway, in the sense that that brings me back to what I said before. What if the problem is not something that we can see by the way that I explained with patent law? So when I was dealing with it, I was like, it's fine. I don't see any problems. I don't see any gender-related aspect. Yet, there it was. So now I'm a bit like, from the offset, when the regulation is being created, when the law is being created, there may be aspects that have not been considered at all in a way that you cannot really exactly see in the law. So it kind of brings me back to what you guys said, that these things need to be done with a specific mindset in mind, and the feminist perspective is something that can add a lot to this, and I think that it can bridge a lot of gaps in that regard.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to give the floor to the audience. If you have any questions to ask to the reviewers or to the author, and also this is the same for you, like if you have any question for Amanda, or Amanda, if you have any other question, this is your chance.
Yeah, thanks for this mind-blowing panel, by the way. It enlightened me a lot as a woman. I wanted to touch upon on the last point that you actually raised, because now we're gonna, our panel will be about the Metaverse Gallery. And if we take, it's like a comment that I want to make, and I really want to hear your opinions on it. If we take sci-fi works more seriously, maybe we would be prepared for what might happen in the future, because the term of metaverse actually coined in a sci-fi book called Snow Crash, and Second Life gave us a lot of incidents that might happen in the future, and it actually opens like a lot of gates that what could still happen in the future. And one doesn't really need to experience the rape physically, but the feeling or the sensation of it, sometimes it is enough to get scared and traumatized for a lifetime. And now we're only thinking about the metaverse as its like infancy and its like reality, but what happens when we have the transmitter skins? What happens when we have like headsets that directly linked to our brain that enables us to actually feel what we feel inside. So I think at this century, at the 21st century, the division between online and physical shouldn't be that distinct, should be more blurred, and we should be more prepared about what might happen in the future, maybe through reading like imaginatory works that written 70 years ago. So that might help us as like lawyers or policymakers to be ready, to be more ready for the future. Thank you.
I so agree with you, and I actually have a paper to recommend. It's called Dystopian Trademark Revelations, and it's a paper that I wrote that looks at dystopian technologies that are inspired by dystopian novels or ephemera. It looks at Palantir, which is from Lord of the Rings and is used to surveil immigrants. It looks at Mechanical Turk, which is used to obfuscate the labor that is used to annotate AI training data, as well as do content moderation and make it seem as if it is done by magic, even though human labor is the fuel. And it also looks at Panopto, which if you're an educator, you're probably familiar with the Panopto system that surveils students in the guise of accessibility. But when you think about the fact that the technology is named after Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, which is a prison system for constant surveillance that creates inescapable fear and a lack of autonomy among the surveilled, it's a pretty problematic name for the technology itself. So if you're curious about how those names can inform technologies and what we can learn from them, I would really encourage you to go look up Dystopian Trademark Revelations, because I think you're exactly right that a lot of these companies are inspired by the dystopia rather than reacting to it.
For
Waffles,
that,
don't drink them.
yeah,
Sorry, my cat's trying to drink my coffee.
Before giving the floor to you, I just want to respond very quickly to what you raised. Like one very quickly reaction and reflection that I had is that I am wondering if and how we can convince the national legislators in order to do so, like to adjust the legislation according to the current needs of the society, the digital needs of the society, speaking about metaverse. And I was wondering, like, there is no consensus, there is not still consensus about the definition of rape based on that it's sex without consent. They don't even agree on that. And it's 21st century. Like, I don't know, I'm trying to save some hope for the future, but I don't know how easily we can convince them to be more creative, like more flexible, not so much conservative, if I can share a personal opinion. So yeah, I don't know if they are going to get some inspiration from science fiction. I highly support this, but I'm wondering how we are going to convince them. But please, if you have any reflections.
Just to extend maybe your question and your reflection, I'm also really fond of science fiction, and I know that it is there to somehow warn us of what it is to come. I think we're all aware that we have a new era of somatization of how we understand and how we see bodies and how bodies are integrated and are jumping from the cyber to the physical space in a way that there is no distinction between them. But I think it might be quite hard to convince somebody to work on something on a preventive phase. What I see as a legal researcher going through the legislation, I see that there is a lot of effort, but for intervention, not for prevention. So, in my opinion, we have to shift this focus to, in our way, to contribute to altering and give more importance to the phase before facing a problem, not to the phase afterwards. And this is, in my opinion, the most difficult thing to do. And I know I'm not providing an answer or a solution or anything, but I think that even this reflection can put us towards a way to think of something more creative or more flexible, or more humane in a way.
Yeah, not very much to add. I think that in general, the idea is to start looking into sources of information, as I was mentioning earlier of that last chapter, sources of knowledge that are not the dominant voices. So the more creative, the better. And I mean, of course, we're still talking about very big novels like 1984, and that was envisioned, and it can be happening. So why not sci-fi?
Yeah, the days of future past. It's, in our line of work in cybersecurity, it's something that we see a lot. You know, you think it's science fiction one day, and then you see it happening just a few years later. It's something that is absolutely right. From a legal standing point, I think everything goes. Well, yes, we need to be prepared because you've seen it happening, but I guess there is an overarching problem in the sense that you legislate in order to favor public interest and specific civil rights. You legislate in order to favorite markets and profit making. I mean, there are things that are, powers and dynamics in the market that make things very, very difficult. There was something that I read in the book, for example, that platforms favor engagement over safety. So when hate speech is posted online, the platform immediately picks up on it, and it just perpetuates the same thing, even though it's hurtful to somebody, and in reality as well, in the physical world, right? Not even in the in the platform itself. So many societal changes that need to happen to affect that.
Does anyone have any further questions? Yes. Thank you.
Yes, I have a boring question and probably a wrong question because I was late, but I was just hearing all the comments and looking at the title of the book that I have not read, so it makes things also a bit difficult. But the title is called Feminist Cyberlaw. So is Cyberlaw, was this clear to you that it was Cyberlaw, or did you have any hesitations about digital laws, data laws, whatever? And then is it, how can we then discuss cyberlaw if you're all saying, no, it's not only cyber, it is also real life. So any reflections about this? Will the next volume be called Feminist Law? I don't know, what is the plan? Thank you.
It's such a good question. So cyberlaw was sort of the term of art in the 1990s and early aughts. It's now been kind of fractured, at least in the United States, into things like law and technology or technology and law or other blank ands. But I think what's so powerful about cyber law as both a concept and a construct is real cyber law scholars never thought that there was a difference between online and offline. Intellectual property scholars were some of the earliest scholars in the cyber law space thinking about copyright law, and they were more aware than probably anyone that piracy that happens digitally is no different than piracy that happens on a tape deck. And I think that the cyber law as a concept has been imbued through decades of scholarship with this tactile realness, right? That I think is so important, because one thing that draws together all of the essays in the volume, which I hope you'll buy and read, is that these are real, these have physical, real concrete effects. And one of the examples I'll give is from my essay, Feminist Use, which suggests that we have the fair use doctrine in copyright law in the United States. And often fair use excuses colonialist, sexist, coercive, invasive uses, which really presents an FU in fair use, right? And one of the powerful things about fair use, even though it creates those offline harms of subordination and feelings of inferiority, right, which are very real and measurable and tangible, it can also be used to make libraries more accessible to disabled people, children, parents, the public during a global public health crisis of a pandemic. And I think that the feminist use piece really illustrates that when we're talking about things that happen in cyberspace, like a digital library collection, well, reading a book is not a digital experience, even if you're using a digital intermediary. This cat is just so ready to be on screen. Sorry. She just keeps going back and forth. So I think that Cyberlaw, part of why we chose it is because it is imbued with this tactile sense of offlineness that is critical to understand and center if we are hoping to make progress using feminist cyberlaw. So it was a very intentional choice. Also, feminist technology law or feminist law in technology just doesn't sound as catchy, I would say. And if you haven't seen the cover of the book, it looks really good in print.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I haven't read the book, so I'm going to ask a question. I mean, we missed the beginning of the panel, so I hope you didn't cover that. But it's about the solutions and the limits or not that you see of the participation. Like, we need more women, we need more diversity to change things. I mean, does the book talk about that? Or, I mean, and even so, like, what do you think? Because usually, yeah, the papers that, I mean, at least the ones I read, it usually ends with that. It's just, yeah, we need more participation to change things. But do you think that there's another alternative, or are there limits to this approach?
Yeah, so I would actually say that none of the, I mean, the patent essay kind of gets at that, but it's a little bit of a bigger problem. I don't think any of the essays suggest that the solution to misogynistic cyber law policies is more women in tech. You know, respondents disagree, nod or shake your head if you think that that was the solution of a lot of papers. But I think that there were a more diverse array of solutions. And I will say, women aren't always good for women, right? There are a lot of women out there who who really suck. And having more women who suck in places of power doesn't help women. I would much rather have a strong male ally than someone who has my shared characteristics but not my shared interests making decisions to empower me. And so I think that one thing I would say about feminist cyber law, the reason we're not just focused on gender, this is about gender, race, sexuality, disability, and class, is you don't know where those allies are, but we want to invite everyone to be an ally around the table, not just people who are women or present as women or are femme, right? We want all gender identities, we want all races, we want all abilities, right? We want all socioeconomic classes. These are all rich opportunities for camaraderie and collaboration. And I do think that if we focus on just increasing the number of women, that's how we get that meme that was going around during the early Trump administration. That's like, more women prison guards. And it's like, we don't want more women prison guards. We don't want prisons. We have to radically reimagine a different world in which putting people who look like us in power is not the only way to regain our autonomy, I think.
I have 1 minute. Do you have any reflections? Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you so much, Amanda, for taking the time and for presenting
Thank you for having me. This
book.
was wonderful.
The book is going to be published next month, so yes, please stay in touch. And thank you so much, Anastasia, Plixavra, and Alex, for accepting the invitation and for sharing your insights. Spoiler alert for tomorrow, we are going to discuss the book When Youth Rape Goes Viral, and it is about image-based sexual abuse, sexualized deepfakes, and child safety. Then the session tomorrow will take place at 5:20 in the same room, in Cinema Room, and looking forward to welcoming you tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of CPDP, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.